It goes back to the time that I spent with Nadia Boulanger. When I was 12 years old, I went to Fontainebleau at the American Conservatory there, which is a summer program, the months of July and August. And I was there for 5 summers. And I lived alone in Paris when I was 14, 15. That was a big adventure. And working with her was an extraordinary challenge and an extraordinary inspiration. And she had an uncanny ability to look at a young musician and have a sense of what direction that musician might ideally take. She never talked about it with me, never. But the fact of the matter is that when I was a senior at Harvard, about to graduate, anyone who graduated in that year, many years ago, 1968, faced being drafted and sent off to fight the war in Vietnam. And that was a very, very scary thing. I was not raised to think of getting an M16 rifle and killing people. I was sure that I would become an early casualty of that conflict if I were actually drafted and went over there. And as the spring uh, moved on and I got closer and closer to graduation, I became more and more panicky about my future. I had an acceptance from the Harvard Music Department to do a doctorate in composition, but I knew that the draft board would never allow me to do that. And one morning I went downstairs to my mailbox, opened up my letterbox, and there was a letter in very elegant stationery, handwritten in a handwriting that was clearly not American. But I could not place it. And I looked at the return address and it said 2022 Delancey Place, Philadelphia, which meant nothing to me. I opened up the letter and it was a letter from Rudolf Serkin, who was writing me in the capacity of his being the director of the Curtis Institute of Music, inquiring whether I might be interested in heading the theory department at Curtis. I was 20. At first I thought this had to be some kind of cruel joke, that some of my college classmates had sprung on me, because it was inconceivable to me that Rudolf Serkin, who was a pianist that I venerated and whose recitals and appearances with orchestra I had attended with my family, that he could even know of my existence. On the other hand, he gave me a telephone number to contact, and it was a Philadelphia area code, and there was this elegant stationery, and I had nothing to lose. So I called him up and he said, "Oh, yes, Mr. Levin, you got my letter." I said, "My God, this really is Rudolf Serkin. I can't believe it." And he said, "Why don't you come down to Philadelphia and let's talk a little bit and see where we end up." And so I took the train down from Boston through New York to Philadelphia, and I rang his doorbell, and there he was, the most extraordinary musician that he was. And he invited me in, and we had a cup of tea, and we talked about this and that, and what a young musician needed as part of his or her training. And then with his eyes twinkling, he said, "You probably think this is just as crazy as I do, but if I'm to believe Nadia Boulanger, you are the person I need to run the theory department at Curtis. What is your answer?" And I said, "My answer is yes." And so it was thanks to Nadia Boulanger that I was hired to run a program in theory there, teach young musicians, many of whom were older than I was, uh, who didn't like it very much. But I ended up writing textbooks in conjunction with the teaching of that theory program. I hired colleagues that I had studied with in France, and my former piano teacher, Louis Martin, also, and we wrote these books. And I became very committed to working there. I was at Curtis for 5 years, and then I was hired by Michael Hammond, the Dean of Music at the School of the Arts, State University of New York College at Purchase. Suddenly, in January of 1979, I got a telegram from France asking me if I might be available for an important post. It was a telegram from Nadia Boulanger, and what she was asking me to do was to take over running the American Conservatory for her, because she was close to the end at that point. She was quite frail, and in fact, she was transported in an ambulance down to the Palace of Fontainebleau, to the apartment that she normally occupied in the summer sessions when she taught. And she lay in that bedroom in a coma for most of the summer, and a few months after the end of the session, she actually passed away. And there I was teaching in her stead in Fontainebleau. I couldn't imagine it, but she was the daughter of a Russian princess, you know, and she wasn't exactly used to having people say no to her. So if she felt that this was something that she wanted me to do, I had no choice but to accept. And I remembered the ways she inspired me, the way she had challenged me, the way she had approached this panoply of music over the centuries that she knew inside and out, from the medieval to the present. And I did my best to continue in that tradition. And a few months later, as I say, after I had left, she passed away. And I started to think about this. And I thought, you know, at the time that she got me the position at Curtis, she surely knew what a perilous situation I was in because of the risk of being drafted and being killed and so on and so forth. And I thought of that as simply a way of her helping me. But then I put together the fact that she had recommended me to Rudolf Serkin in 1968 and the fact that she had summoned me to take her place in 1979. And I suddenly realized the whole thing was coming into focus, that she had decided that my calling, like hers, was to be an educator, someone who would challenge, who would inspire, who would help people find their own path. And that she quietly, without saying a word to me, simply made it her business to open those doors and to encourage me to move in that trajectory, which is extraordinarily moving, and to this day I find absolutely astonishing.
You have such large areas of studies and research. How do you go about your research?
When I was a child of 10 or 11, that was a year in which Leonard Bernstein did his broadcasts on television that became his book, The Joy of Music. And I remember it was February of 1958, so I was 10 years old, and we turned on the black and white TV in our living room. And the program at hand was Bernstein talking about Bach. Now, of course, I had played Bach. I had started studying the piano when I was 5, so, you know, I would play preludes and fugues and so on. I mean, E minor toccata, my teachers would assign me Bach. Of course, everybody gets assigned Bach. It's part of your daily bread. And I accepted it as such, but it had never had the impact on me that this extraordinarily passionate lecture demonstration that Bernstein did, playing parts of the Magnificat and the St. Matthew Passion and all sorts of other pieces. And I was completely overwhelmed. And I became a complete Bach fanatic. And I persuaded my uncle to go to a music store in Manhattan, and I wanted to buy every cantata that I could find. And in those days, the number of cantatas you could find in a music store were about 12 out of the more than 200. And a few years went by, and I was getting my music not in New York, but from Blackwell's music shop in Oxford, in England. A friend of mine, a fellow student of mine at Fontainebleau, apprised me of this music shop and how well stocked they were, and that this would be a very good way of me getting, you know, cheaper music, anything I wanted. And in their quarterly bulletin on the back page, they announced the publication of the new Bach edition, the complete works of Bach. And I went on bended knee to my family and said, I have to have this. I must have this. And my parents said, we can't afford it. It was very expensive, you know. 4 or 5 volumes would come out a year, and every time a volume came out, it was like Christmas morning for me. The brown cloth volume with Bach's coat of arms on the front of it, and what was it going to be? Was it going to be the French suites, or would it be organ music, or would it be a volume of cantatas or the Christmas oratorio? I mean, it was, to me, an extraordinary moment when that happened. I would rush to the piano and start sight reading from the scores to immerse myself in this music, most of which I had not previously known. And a few years later, I found out that there was a new Mozart edition too, and I again went down on bended knee. And my uncle was the guardian angel of my musical career. He played all of the woodwind instruments: flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, saxophone. He accompanied me to Fontainebleau and paid for my education there because my parents couldn't afford it. So he became a second father to me over there, and he agreed to finance the Bach edition and the Mozart edition for me. The Mozart love that I got with Mother's Milk came from my father. He was a dental ceramist. He made false teeth of porcelain, but he revered Mozart. He owned 150 albums of Mozart before I knew that there was a person named Mozart. You know, in those days, most of the music that you got on recordings was on 78 records. You know, 4 minutes on a side. So you'd listen to a piece and it would stop and you'd have to take the record off and flip it over and then do the next. You got used to these. I still remember some of the side breaks and some of these recordings that I used to listen to. And I still have all of these recordings, which I inherited from my father. And in those days, if you wanted to buy an opera like The Marriage of Figaro, it was something like 30 records. You know, and if one of them smashed, it was very easy to do because they were very brittle. Then you couldn't buy a replacement. You'd have to buy the whole set all over again, you know. So there was my father listening to Mozart, and I was getting Mozart like Mother's Milk, and there was, thanks to Bernstein, was my love of Bach, and Bach and Mozart got to be a big, big deal. And I would open up the volumes when they came in, and I was noticing that there were things that weren't quite right. For instance, I would get an opera by Mozart, and in the recitatives, they had the keyboard reduction to plunking the chords, you know, as the singer sang and recited what was going on in the plot, the keyboard, usually a harpsichord, would play accompaniments. And I noticed that there were severe voice leading errors in these accompaniments, things that Nadia Boulanger, as my theory teacher, would never have tolerated. And I was astonished that, you know, here was a volume that cost $200 and it contained elementary grammatical errors. This is crazy. I couldn't understand it. And I was quite outraged about it, you know, too. Or, for instance, I would get a volume, and there was a volume of string quartets by Mozart, and in the back of it, in an appendix, it said, here is a sketch to an unknown string quartet in C major, question mark. And I looked at it and said, but that's the C major flute quartet. I'm 16 years old, and I know that this is the C major flute quartet, and here's the editor of this volume, this world-renowned Mozart specialist, who doesn't even recognize what this piece is. This is just incredible. And I began to realize that maybe when they say war is too important to be left to the generals, that maybe scholarship is too important to be left to the musicologists, and that I would need to start to immerse myself in scholarship to understand and better contribute to the discipline. So I became a musicologist, not, you know, because I took lots of courses in musicology. I took a few courses in history at Harvard as an undergraduate, but nothing that really prepared me for the task at hand. And then something was to happen that changed everything, which was that when I was a junior at Harvard, a friend of mine announced to me that he was going to lead a performance of the Mozart Requiem at the local church, which actually happens to be approximately 500 feet from where I'm sitting right now. I was in Adam's house across the street from St. Paul's Church. He said, how would you like to play the organ part in this performance of the Mozart Requiem? I thought, oh my God, that would be fantastic. He said, well, I've got the new complete works score, which of course I had too because I was subscribing to it. He said, there's a sketch in the end of it for a fugue that Mozart intended to use to end the Lacrimosa section of the Requiem, which his assistant Süssmayr never used. How about you finish it and we'll incorporate it into our performance? And I looked at him and I said, you've got to be kidding. I mean, there are many easier ways to make a complete fool of yourself than to do something like that. And he said, don't reject it out of hand. Give it some thought. Well, Isabella, it happens that the previous summer, I was studying conducting at the academy in Nice, the summer academy, with Hans Swarovski, and we started talking about Mozart piano concertos. And he said, if you want to play Mozart piano concertos idiomatically, you have to improvise. Improvise? What do you mean? He said, well, when the orchestra's playing in the tutti sections, you're supposed to, you know, make stuff up. And then when the tune comes back again, you're supposed to decorate it. And the cadenzas, you're supposed to improvise. I said, I don't know anybody who does that. He said, well, you obviously have never heard Friedrich Gulda play. And I said, well, it's true, I haven't. He said, well, I made a recording of 2 Mozart concertos with him. Buy the recording, listen to it, and imitate it. So I went out and I went to a local record shop in Nice and I found the recording, took it back to New York, put it on, and I just flipped out. I mean, this was wild stuff. Of course, Goulda was a great jazz pianist as well as a classical player who made path-breaking recordings of Mozart and Beethoven sonatas and so on, you know. And I thought, well, I want to do this. This is fantastic. What a great idea. But how am I going to be able to learn to improvise in the style of Mozart? And this conductor comes along and says to me, well, you know, how about you finish this fugue? And I thought, if you want to improvise in the style of Mozart, first of all, you have to be able to compose in the style of Mozart. If you want to run, first you got to walk. So suddenly it didn't seem so crazy to try to finish this Amen fugue for the performance of the Requiem. So I did it. And having done that, I began to think, I wonder if Mozart left any other pieces unfinished when he died. The Requiem, everybody knows, he died while he was trying to finish it. So that's clear. But is there anything else? And I discovered that there were over 140 major musical torsos by Mozart that were not left hanging because they weren't any good, but because someone maybe knocked at the door and commissioned him to write a piece for wind ensemble while he was writing a string quartet. And he needed the money, so he had to put the string quartet on the side and write the wind piece. And so later on, when I met Alan Tyson, who was a great Mozart scholar, whose expertise was looking at the kinds of music paper that Mozart used, and establishing a chronology of the music by looking at all the pieces that were written on that particular kind of paper. And he was able to show that many completed works by Mozart, some of his most famous, were unfinished. They were fragments that were lying on his desk for as much as 10 years. And suddenly I thought, I'm not going to stay in the French department where I was majoring in French. I'm going to transfer into the music department and write a thesis on the unfinished works by Mozart. And then I'll take a few representative unfinished works. I'll go to Europe, look at the manuscripts, and compose performable completions of these things. And that's basically how I got embarked on this, because I thought, I need to look at these manuscripts myself, and I need to analyze them. So what I was doing was combining performance with theory, with musicology, which was an unusual thing for people to do. And I was looked upon with a certain degree of suspicion by people, because the musicologists didn't like the fact that I was a performer, and the performers didn't like the fact that I was a theorist, and the theorists didn't like the fact that I was doing scholarship. You know how it is. So gradually I got involved in all of this, and it became a second life. I mean, I do see myself primarily as a performer and always have. But by studying the music, by looking at it very carefully, I have been able to understand things about the language of composers, Mozart first and foremost perhaps, but Bach as well, and Schubert and Beethoven and many other composers as well, and to take the knowledge that comes from that study to inform my performance. So I understand performance practice, the kinds of assumptions that composers make. A lot of these things are not very widely known by my fellow musicians. Things like the difference in Schubert between decrescendo and diminuendo. Most people think they're more or less similar. But by examining Schubert's manuscripts, you realize that he tells you decrescendo to get softer, rallentando to get slower, and when he writes diminuendo, he wants you to get softer and slower. And after a while, he'll write after diminuendo a tempo, which is a really important thing to know and a dangerous thing not to know.
These days, kids are very, very busy, including music major students and college at the conservatory level. Where to start?
First of all, you have to have the curiosity to want to develop a particular sense of the language of each individual composer. I think that's very important. You know, generations ago, performers wanted to be recognized above all for their personality. So that a great violinist like Heifetz uses the same kind of vibrato for Bach as he does for Sibelius, because he wants people to recognize his sound, which was, of course, phenomenal. But there are, to use an analogy, there are actors who always play themselves and actors who immerse themselves in the character that they're supposed to play. John Wayne is always John Wayne. But Dustin Hoffman is all sorts of people. Bette Davis is Bette Davis, but Meryl Streep is anybody and everybody that she wants to be. So you have, first of all, to think that you want to play Ravel differently from Debussy, to say nothing of playing him differently from Brahms or from Schumann. And you want Mendelssohn to be different from Schumann and Haydn to be different from Mozart. How do you do that? Well, first of all, you have to want to. And if what you're thinking is that within 18 months you want to win the first prize at the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow, or the Leeds competition, or the Dublin competition, or any number of international wonderful competitions, there are a lot of people who feel they just can't take the time to do this because they have to perfect their technique. Well, it's fine to perfect your technique and to develop a fluency and a coloristic approach to playing. But if all of your performances sound the same, after a while, people will tire of what you have to offer, and you will tire yourself of playing in the same manner all of the time. So one has, first of all, to have a sense of wanting to change personality from composer to composer, and sometimes from piece to piece in a composer's music. You think of early Brahms sonatas and you think about the late intermezzi, they're very, very different. Or even, for instance, early Bach and late Bach, or early Mozart and late Mozart. All of these things are very, very different. So you have to have a desire to immerse yourself in the language of a composer and try to make your interpretation bring something which is very, very personal and stems from the composer's ideas, but then allows you to liberate yourself within that language. And it takes some time. Of course it takes some time. You have to be willing to open up the score and notice individual things, like a particular chord, which Mendelssohn uses, but Schumann doesn't. Or a particular kind of melodic style that Beethoven uses, for instance, that Haydn, his teacher, does not. If you don't notice these things, it's not tragic, but if you do notice these things, it makes you very excited because you can bring such personification to the way you play. So, yeah, it takes a bit of time, but the time is very, very well worth taking. And of course, you've got to have good editions, because there are many editions out there which contain a lot of performance indications, dynamics, slurs, staccati, all sorts of performance indications which come from a performer who may not necessarily have an insight into this music as the composer intended it. So you have to have good editions, and if you're particularly curious, then you may want to try to get copies of manuscripts, because it's the manuscript that shows you what the composer actually wrote. And in this day and age when so much is available, I mean, when I was a young musician growing up, you could get a couple of editions of standard repertoire, but most of the stuff was not available. Now we've got IMSLP, and everybody can go online to imslp.org, and you can see first editions and often color facsimiles of the composer's manuscripts, which you can download and print for nothing. So these are opportunities which we have now, which would have been unthinkable only 10 or 15 years ago. So I really recommend to musicians to look at this, because it's very exciting to actually see when the composer has crossed something out and corrected it. And you can look at it and say, now, why did that composer make that decision? And suddenly you say, oh, because, well, look, you see the right hand and the left hand, they were clashing with one another. And so he made something smoother. Oh, and you begin to realize that composers may be inspired, but they have to do a lot of thinking.
I would like to return to Mozart a little bit. How do you understand Mozart as you see it?
Well, first of all, I would never say to somebody, don't do this, don't do that. You know, it's the philosophy, for instance, in which a young person comes into a lesson, and the teacher decides that he or she is going to spend as much time as necessary to tell the young musician all of the things that are being done wrong. And that's enormously depressing. You know, it's not a good way to get a young musician excited about making music. It's much better to point to the stars above than to the mud below. That's very, very important. And to try to communicate when you teach the characteristics of the music that make it Mozart, that make it different from other composers who were writing at that time, Haydn or later Beethoven, and that they understand the rhythms, the harmonic vocabulary, the chords that Mozart likes, the ones that he avoids, the way he tells stories, the way the music moves from one point to the next with a typical 4 bars asking a question, 4 bars giving an answer. The way he tries cleverly to cause you to want to have happen what he's decided is going to happen. In other words, he sells you on the music doing something so that when he does what he wants, you have wanted it and you're very happy, because it also shows that you're smart, because you predicted what he was going to do. Now, of course, he can't all of the time give you what you expect, because then you'll think you're smarter than he is. So every once in a while, he's got to do something astonishing that you would never expect. And of course, he's in a position to do things astonishing that you would never accept all of the time. But like the person on a street corner with 3 walnut shells and a pea, and the pea is hidden under one of the walnut shells, and you have to decide which one is hiding the pea. When you step up for the first time, you'll start to guess, and you always seem to guess right. But then when he suddenly says, let's play for money, $20, suddenly it becomes rather difficult to figure out under which walnut shell that pea is to be found. And if you lose all of the time, you'll stop playing. So if you're listening to Mozart and Mozart is never doing what you expect, you'll turn off. You won't be involved. So he is always balancing the predictable with the surprising. And we tend to think of Mozart as simple. And often teachers say you must not destroy the classic simplicity of his music by playing in a too complicated way. Whereas when he was alive, people, including the emperor, who was a well-cultivated person, complained that Mozart's music was too complicated. And the emperor famously said in one case that Mozart's music was very beautiful, but it had too many notes. And Mozart, who was not a born diplomat, said not one more than was absolutely necessary, which is not a good way to get a job, by the way. But it shows you something about the fact that if in his time people thought his music was very complicated, and we find that it seems simple, and we put that together with the fact that young musicians, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, who start to compose music, very often compose in the style of Mozart, don't they? They do. So there's something about how Mozart presents music that makes it seem easy, direct, natural, simple. And I don't know what kind of music talented young people composed before there was a Mozart. You know, they didn't have that to imitate. But there is this music which, if you listen to it carefully, it engages you in what's going to happen, makes you think along with what the composer is writing, And you feel gratified when you're right and intrigued when you're wrong, but it brings you along for the ride. And therefore, people who talk about the Mozart effect, that listening to this music will get you smarter, may be onto something. Because if you listen to this music and it kind of takes you along for the ride and implies where the music is going, then after a while you become a little bit more cultivated, a little bit more clever about how you respond. And so young musicians who want to understand how music as a language works can study Mozart to their profit because it's quite natural.
Could you share some of the projects you've done in the past, in the current, and maybe even in the future?
At this point, the number of CDs I've recorded approaches 100, and they're quite varied. I mean, people often associate me with Mozart, but I've commissioned a large number of works and recorded them. Composers uh, such as Bernard Ranz, Yehudi Weiner, John Harbison, Thomas Obo Lee, the Romanian composer Hans-Peter Türk, many contemporary works, which I'm very proud to have commissioned. And these Mozart completions that I've done, had published, are complemented also by completions of Schubert and Bach, among others. I've been working for the last year and a half on a book about the Mozart piano concertos, which will be designed not just for scholars, but for music lovers. And I started to work on it during this fellowship in Munich, and I'm continuing to work on it. It's hard work, and I'm working from color facsimiles of the manuscripts so that I can suggest to the people who read something about Mozart's creative process, which in itself is quite astonishing to me. ECM Records will be releasing this fall my recording of all of the Mozart piano sonatas played on Mozart's own piano. We did these recordings in Salzburg, of course, because the piano is in the Mozart Museum there. The complete recording of the Mozart piano concertos, which I embarked upon in 1993 with Christopher Hogwood in the Academy of Ancient Music and was suspended in the year 2000, is now going to be resumed. And so within the next 2 years, we'll finally get the whole set of the Mozart piano concertos, or actually the concertos for 1, 2, and 3 keyboards, which we're recording on period instruments, forte pianos, harpsichords, tangent pianos, organ, the whole schmear. It should be, I think, entertaining for audiences to experience these pieces in their different coloristic guises.